Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take these gargantuan mountains of research you've provided and, well, we try to distill them into the most essential mind-bending insights.
And today's a big one, a really big one.
It is. We are undertaking a truly massive intellectual endeavor today. We're diving deep into a synthesis of contemporary history, a work so enormous, it attempts to trace the hidden forces that shape the entire modern world. Specifically, that tumultuous period between 1900 and 1960.
It is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, a monumental undertaking. The source material stretches to over 1,300 pages. It's a self-described attempt to provide a comprehensive historical perspective on events that were, for the author, contemporary.
Right, happening in his lifetime.
Exactly, and that required an almost audacious methodology. The author knew that the truly indispensable documents you need, the private memos, the cabinet minutes, all that stuff, they were simply unavailable. Still classified.
So how do you write history when the raw evidence is still locked away in a vault somewhere? That seems impossible.
Well, you remedy the deficiency of evidence. You do it by projecting the long patterns of past history into the present, looking for these underlying structures that tend to repeat themselves.
So it's not just a political history.
Oh, not at all. It's a full synthesis. The goal was to connect the dots across every spectrum of human activity simultaneously. Political, economic, military, technological, social, and intellectual. It's an integrated history of civilization itself.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission today is to follow that ambitious thread. We need to focus on the key patterns that this work, that Quigley, identifies. We're tracking the major shifts in economic power, the changes in social organization, national psychology, and critically, the chain of diplomatic failures that led to the 20th century's worst crises.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the entire analysis, the whole thing, it hinges on this one audacious premise. Western civilization, like all the ones before it, doesn't just evolve in a straight line.
It's not linear progress.
Not at all. It cycles through these predictable, massive phases of vitality and decay. And we are charting the catastrophic shift that defined the early 20th century, the collapse into what he calls an age of conflict, and trying to understand what, if anything, could lead to a stable transition into a new age of expansion.
All right, let's start right there. That fundamental premise, Quigley's big framework. He's arguing that the way a civilization organizes itself, its knowledge, its capital, it all follows this clear, predictable rhythm.
Yeah.
How does he define these patterns? I mean, where does Western civilization even begin in this model?
He describes civilization as beginning in a period of intense cultural mixture. Western civilization, as we understand it, arose from the tumultuous combination of four distinct worlds. You have the remnants of the Roman system.
They're the classical world.
Right. Then the influence of the barbarian tribes who overran it. Then the Saracen world Islamic culture, which, preserved so much classical knowledge that Europe had lost.
And the fourth.
And, significantly, the Jewish world, which provided the spiritual and ethical basis for Christianity. This whole mixing pot period happened roughly between 350 and 700 AD. From this mixture, the society develops and eventually enters these two contrasting, massive ages.
So what distinguishes the good times, the thriving years, the age of expansion from this age of conflict?
The difference really boils down to social organization and capital accumulation. The age of expansion is characterized by several key metrics. You see a robust resumption of large-scale capital accumulation and investment.
So people are building things, investing in the future.
Yes, and that leads to strong demographic growth,
Yeah.
population increases, you see geographic expansion, think colonization, new territories, and a significant expansion of knowledge and technological innovation. It's a period of, collective optimism and widely shared prosperity.
And the age of conflict. That's just the opposite, a mirror image.
It is the systemic breakdown. The age of conflict, which Quigley identifies as starting to appear around 1890, is marked by decreasing rates of investment and capital accumulation.
Which would lead to scarcity, more competition for resources.
Precisely. And that's when you see a revival of imperialism, intensified class struggle, and social friction. You get frequent and incredibly violent warfare and a descent into irrationality and emotional extremism. The whole society becomes rigid, defensive.
That pattern. I mean, that sounds exactly like the world ramping up to the assassination in Sarajevo in 1914.
It's a perfect fit. The core areas of Western civilization Europe began exhibiting these symptoms of conflict around 1890, and by 1930, the shift was unmistakable. The ultimate proof of this civilizational failure came during World War II.
How so?
In 1942, the core of the civilization, Europe, was conquered by a semi-peripheral state, Germany, and defeat was only achieved by calling in a genuinely peripheral state, the United States, and an outside civilization entirely, the Soviet society.
So the core couldn't save itself.
It couldn't. This dependence on external forces signals a profound crisis in the core civilization itself.
The stakes here feel incredibly high. Because you mentioned earlier, civilizations followed this same path. What happens if this age of conflict doesn't resolve itself successfully? What does the history of decay actually look like?
This is where Quigley offers his bleakest, but also his most historically grounded prediction. If the age of conflict continues, if the system can no longer manage its internal stresses, it tends to consolidate into a universal empire.
To universal empire, like the Roman Empire.
Exactly like the Roman Empire, which arose after the conflict phase of Hellenistic civilization burned itself out. In the 20th century context, this would likely be an empire ruled by the dominant peripheral state, which at that time was, of course, the United States.
But he doesn't see that empire as a good thing, as a stable outcome.
No, not at all. Historically, the universal empire is not a golden age. It's a period of stagnation and increasing decay. Because all internal conflict has been suppressed, the society loses its vigor, its adaptability, its ability to innovate.
It just ossifies.
It ossifies. And it's followed by a prolonged period of internal rot, usually culminating in invasion from outside and the total destruction of that specific culture. The only way out, the only way to increasing prosperity and power, the historical escape route, is if Western civilization can successfully reorganize itself, reforming its institutions, adapting its ideologies, and transition into a fourth age of expansion.
Wow. That framework really puts the immediate events of the 20th century into stark relief. Speaking of those events, what were the big psychological shocks that forced people to realize the old age of expansion was well and truly over?
There were three chief shattering experiences that profoundly disturbed the patterns of behavior and belief in the Western world. First was the sheer unbelievable trauma of the First World War. Second, the long drawn-out agony of the World Depression. And third, the unprecedented ideological violence and destruction of the Second World War.
And of those three, you've identified World War I as the chief catalyst. Why specifically WWI and not the Depression, which was so immediately crippling for so many?
Because the First World War shattered the belief system itself. Before 1914, the prevailing Western intellectual tradition was rooted in the Enlightenment legacy. There was this unshakable faith in man's innate goodness, in inevitable material progress, and the fundamental harmony of interests.
War was seen as a relic of the past.
A relic of barbarism, exactly. Something that advanced, rational societies had largely left behind.
And then reality hit like a freight train.
Like a freight train. The industrial scale of the slaughter, millions dead, billions wasted, the introduction of poison gas and trench warfare, it was psychologically incomprehensible within that framework of rational progress. They just couldn't integrate it.
So what do they do?
Well, the universal determination in 1919 was not to fundamentally change the world, but to restore it exactly as it was in 1913. The war had to be an inexplicable, temporary aberration.
The attempt to pretend nothing had really changed, despite the millions of ghosts.
Quigley calls it a decade of pretense. Governments, financial institutions, cultural leaders, they all insisted on returning to the gold standard, balancing budgets, ignoring the deep structural economic damage. It took until the stock market crash and the global depression of 1929 for men to be finally and forcibly confronted with the grim new reality.
That's when the fiction collapsed.
That profound economic collapse meant they could no longer sustain it. The age of conflict was now an unavoidable, visible reality for everyone.
Okay, that sets the stage for the economic shift. If the age of expansion was defined by capital accumulation, let's look at who was controlling that capital. Quigley discusses a dramatic shift from commercial capitalism to what he calls monopoly capitalism by the late 19th century. How did that transformation happen?
Oh, commercial capitalism, which was dominant in early Britain, relied on profits from trade, the movement of goods. But as the Industrial Revolution matured, especially in Central Europe and North America, the scale of enterprise just grew exponentially.
You're talking about railroads, steel mills?
Exactly. Building railroads, steel mills, massive electrical grids. These required enormous amounts of outside capital. Where earlier British industry often self-financed through its own commercial profits or rising land values, this later industrialization required powerful external sources of money.
And that's where the international banking dynasty stepped in. Not just as lenders, but as central organizing forces. You describe this as an invisible system.
It was an invisible network of international bankers, private investment firms, who became the true global power brokers. This financial system was often described using the analogy of a solar system.
A solar system.
Yes, the central banks, the Bank of England, the Bank of France, and so on, were the dazzling visible sun. But surrounding it were the almost invisible private investment banking firms. The planets, like Mercury, closest to the sun, that often held the true influence and actually dominated the central bank itself.
That's the part that's so interesting. How did these private firms dominate the visible, public-facing central banks?
They did it by controlling the quantity and flow of money globally, often through these very close, very tight personal networks. They could influence government policy, direct international loans, and determine which industries received capital and which ones were left to starve.
They controlled the spigot.
They controlled the spigot, and they controlled the flow of gold, which anchored the entire global financial system. By being the primary conduits for both state and industrial finance, they became indispensable, and that allowed them to shape the environment in which the central bank had to operate.
The longevity of that power structure is just stunning. You cite a specific example from France.
A very clear one, yes. When the Bank of France underwent reforms in 1936, and this is well after the shock of World War I, deep into the Depression, the Board of Regents, the body that directed the bank, was still dominated by the names of the families who originally set the bank up in 1800.
A century and a half later.
Over a century later. A few later influential names, like the Rothschilds, who were added in 1819, were included, often through marriage and generational continuity. But the core Protestant and German Jewish banking families had been essentially unchanged for over a century. It demonstrates this incredible, rigid continuity of financial control that was operating completely beneath the democratic surface.
It sounds like they understood the basic mechanics of money flow exceptionally well. This brings us to the price system paradox. How did the bankers' natural ideological preferences clash with their actual lending practices, creating these destructive economic cycles?
This paradox is absolutely central to understanding the instability of the era. So the price system depends on 5 core variables. You have the supply and demand for goods, the supply and demand for money, and the speed of exchange.
Okay.
Now, bankers, who generally hold their wealth in the form of money, naturally prefer deflation. When money increases in value, their existing holdings and their outstanding loans are worth more in real terms.
So their ideology favored a tight money supply, keep money scarce and valuable. But their practice was the opposite.
Paradoxically, yes. Their business model was based on making money from interest and from fees. This meant they were constantly eager to lend money, which dramatically increased the volume of bank credit on loan.
And when credit increases faster than the goods being produced,
you get inflation. This created a vicious cycle. They would eagerly inflate credit to maximize their interest income. Then, when the resulting inflation became noticeable or threatened the stability of the system, the banking system would rapidly curtail credit and raise interest rates, forcing a sudden, sharp deflationary crisis.
And the immediate result of that reversal was disastrous for industry, but profitable for them.
It was. This sudden pivot benefited the bankers in the short run because the rapid collapse allowed them to foreclose on collateral land, factories, stock that was held against loans. They could acquire real assets at fire sale prices.
So it was beneficial to them, but absolutely destructive to business, industry, and the labor force in both the short and long term.
Completely destructive. This inherent conflict, this deflationary ideology versus inflationary practice, is what fueled the volatility that characterized the entire period.
This volatility then set the stage for the catastrophic debt issues after World War I. You detail this international debt carousel. It's a truly fascinating mechanism that kept the illusion of global solvency alive for years, all while the bankers collected fees.
It's an essential illustration of how short-run financial maneuvering completely replaced long-term economic reality. The core problem, mandated by the Versailles Treaty, was Germany's reparations.
Right.
Germany could only truly pay these reparations if it maintained a substantial budgetary surplus and a strongly favorable balance of trade. These conditions simply did not exist in post-war Germany.
So if they weren't earning the money to pay, they had to borrow it.
Precisely. The whole system became a carousel fueled by American capital. Between 1924 and 1931, Germany borrowed a staggering 18.6 billion marks, primarily from American investors and banks. This allowed them to pay 10.5 billion marks in reparations.
And the rest of the money, the other 8 billion marks,
The remaining 8.1 billion marks were used to drastically modernize German industry and, quite remarkably, to build non-productive public facilities like swimming pools and post offices, all while maintaining a relatively high standard of living for their people.
So what was the actual circular cash flow internationally? Where did the money go?
It was a perfectly closed loop as long as the lending continued. Foreign exchange went to Germany as American loans, often managed by the same international banking houses.
Okay.
It then went back to Europe, primarily to France, Britain, and Belgium as reparations payments. And finally, it went back across the Atlantic to the United States as payments on the war debts the Allies owed America.
So the money just made a big circle.
A circle. But the critical fatal flaw was that no one was really getting any nearer to solvency. Debts were simply being shifted around, accruing interest, getting more expensive, and the entire structure depended solely on the United States continuing to lend new money to Germany. When that lending stopped in 1931, the entire system collapsed simultaneously.
And while nations were spiraling toward this massive crisis, the managers of the paper system were doing extremely well.
Immensely well. The source notes that while this went on, the international bankers sat in heaven under a rain of fees and commissions. They profited enormously from initiating, managing, and collecting on every single one of those transactions, regardless of the ultimate industrial consequences or the true solvency of the nations involved.
This intense concentration of financial power brings us to the changing nature of the ruling class itself. Karl Marx predicted an entrenched industrial bourgeoisie forever opposing a mass proletariat. Why did that theory become, well, obsolete around 1900?
Marx's theory was made obsolete by two intertwined economic and technological developments that he just hadn't fully foreseen. The first was the absolute necessity of mass consumption.
Right. Mass production needs mass buyers.
Exactly. Mass production, which relied on inanimate power sources, had such immense output that it required vast, sustained demand. This forced producers to raise the standards of living of their own workers. Consequently, the proletariat became fewer, richer, and increasingly moved into the middle class, the exact opposite of Marx's prediction of mass immiseration.
So the worker was leveling up, but who was still pulling the levers of power if the old land-owning bourgeoisie was losing its grip?
And that leads to the second, more crucial development, the deliberate separation of control from ownership. Financial capitalists sought to achieve the widest possible dispersal of ownership, making owners numerous and individually poorer, by using techniques like stock splitting and issuing securities of very low par value.
Why would they want to separate ownership from control? What's the advantage?
To maintain centralized control with minimal personal capital exposure. Control was maintained through these powerful legal and structural mechanisms. You had plural voting stock, non-voting stock, and most effectively, the pyramidal holding companies.
Let's focus on that last one. How does a pyramidal holding company structure centralized power using minimal capital? Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Imagine Company A controls 51% of the voting stock of Company B. Company B, in turn, controls 51% of Company C, and so on down the line. Control flows down the pyramid.
Okay.
So if the total assets of the company at the bottom, say Company D, are $100 million, the financial capitalist who controls the company at the top, Company A, only needs to own 51% of A's capital, which is likely a tiny fraction of that total $100 million asset base.
So you could control a massive enterprise with a relatively small personal investment.
Exactly. It allowed a tiny clique of financial elites who might own only 1% of the total assets to absolutely dictate the policy of the entire $100 million enterprise.
That's a profound structural shift. So the true power transitioned from the industrial owners to this new technical elite.
That's it. Control shifted from the industrial bourgeoisie, who governed because they owned the means of production, to a new, modern group, managerial technicians. These are specialists who possess power not through ownership, but because they are skilled or trained in highly specific techniques, whether that's industrial engineering, corporate finance, or increasingly within government bureaucracies and labor unions. This shift underpins the transition to a mass, middle-class society dominated by specialized expertise, a theme we're going to see repeated in warfare and diplomacy.
If economic control shifted so dramatically, it makes sense that the entire social fabric and the ideological forces defining national identities would fracture as well. Quigley draws these sharp and incredibly insightful contrasts between national temperaments, especially when looking at the roots of the extremism that fueled the age of conflict. Let's start with Russia, which he says had a unique, almost terrifying intellectual climate compared to the West.
The contrast is truly fundamental. The Western tradition, born of that cultural mixture we discussed earlier, always emphasized diversity, toleration, finding a place for every aspect of life in a complex, nuanced reality. Western unity is achieved through diversity and compromise.
Right.
The Russian mind, however, possessed what's described as an insatiable thirst for a single absolute key to life and truth. And once this key was found, whether it was orthodoxy or nihilism or later communism, everything outside of that key had to be rejected as evil, and all men must be compelled to accept that key in a dreadful unity of uniformity.
That desire for an absolute, a single truth must lead to extreme polarization. There's no middle ground.
There is no middle ground. It did. Russian thinkers analyzed experience into these mutually exclusive dualisms, Westerners versus Slavophiles, autocracy versus anarchy, freedom versus fate. And because these convictions were emotionally held faiths, not rational compromises, they led to personalities who could embrace radical, contradictory extremes simultaneously in a way that is just far beyond rational Western analysis.
Can you give us a deeper example of this kind of fanatical extremism, this rejection of foundational elements of human society?
Well, look at their rejection of basic human aspects like reason or property. Alexei Khomyakov, a major Slavophile thinker, sought to reject Western rationalism entirely. He viewed reason as the mortal sin of the West.
The mortal sin.
Yes. The great novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky took this search for absolute truth so far as to wish to destroy all logic and arithmetic. He wanted to free humanity from the tyranny of objective facts, like 2 + 2 = 4, or consider Leo Tolstoy. After a spiritual crisis, he actually denounced his own novels, works considered literary masterpieces, as vain, irrelevant, and even satanic.
He rejected his own life's work.
He rejected the very art form that made him famous.
It creates these staggering personality types you mentioned, the God-intoxicated atheists and belligerent pacifists. How did that paradoxical thinking translate directly into Russia's later political revolutionary philosophy?
That inability to tolerate nuance or compromise is what fueled the all-or-nothing political extremism. If you accept a single, absolute key, say, the total elimination of private property or the revolutionary seizure of the state, then the end justifies any means, no matter how brutal, because the opposing viewpoint is seen as inherently evil. This intellectual foundation really set the stage for the revolutionary intolerance and total control demanded by the Bolsheviks, who were seeking that same dreadful unity.
Now let's contrast that intense search for the absolute Russian mindset with Germany. Quigley identifies a different but equally powerful psychological driver. He says the key to German national character is a thirst for coziness. What on earth does coziness mean in this political context?
It's not about material comfort, it's about psychological relief. Coziness, or Gemütlichkeit, translates to a freedom from the need to make decisions. It's freedom from being an independent, self-reliant individual who is constantly exposed to alternatives.
So it's about avoiding the stress of choice.
Precisely. The agony of decision, the evaluation of alternatives, the acceptance of responsibility is what drives individualism and, critically, rationalism. Both individualism and rationalism are identified as hateful qualities to Germanism.
So totalitarianism and the embrace of status are psychologically appealing because they relieve the individual of the burden of choice. They provide certainty.
They provide certainty. They yearn for an absolute structure that eliminates what's called the chilling breeze of alternatives. This preference for status and the absolute is historically deep-seated. Quigley points to the Augsburg Settlement in 1555. That agreement resolved religious conflict not by granting religious freedom to the individual, but by giving the choice of religion to the prince in each territory.
Quis regio, is religio.
Exactly. Whose realm, his religion. This early preference demonstrated a social desire to transfer the painful need for personal decision up the hierarchy. It prepared the groundwork, centuries later, for embracing a 20th century totalitarian structure that provided comfort and eliminated the need for self-reliance.
Okay, shifting across the channel now to Britain, which projects this ultimate image of robust, established, and rational democracy. Quigley suggests a significant constitutional illusion operates just beneath the surface. Where was the real power operating, hidden from public view?
The constitutional illusion is the common belief that the British system is truly democratic and that the House of Commons controls the cabinet. Quigley asserts the reality is the exact reverse. It is the government that controls the House of Commons. The cabinet is not subservient to the legislature, it dominates it.
How is that control maintained, then, year after year, beneath the surface of the law?
It's exercised through the cabinet's absolute domination of the party machinery. This is the crucial, often unmentioned key to understanding the British oligarchy. They control the party funds, and most critically, they control the nominations to constituencies.
Ah, so they choose the candidates.
They choose the candidates. Because Britain historically lacks primary elections, the ordinary voter has no real say over the selection of the people offered to them. They only choose which of the pre-selected inner cliques nominees wins the seat. And once elected, the party whips ensure members vote on strict party lines. A member of parliament is not expected to understand most bills, only to vote as instructed by the inner party leadership.
So the appearance of political democratization hid this remarkably rigid, enduring class system, especially before World War II.
Absolutely. Even as the vote expanded, the privileged class maintained a nearly impenetrable grasp on crucial non-political power corridors, the senior professions, the military command, and the upper echelons of the civil service.
And how did they do that?
They accomplished this by preserving a highly expensive class-based educational system, the preparatory schools, the so-called public schools, which are actually private and very expensive, and the old universities like Oxford and Cambridge as the absolute prerequisite for entry into the ruling class.
Can you provide us with a specific, tangible detail showing how impenetrable these barriers really were?
The legal profession offers the perfect snapshot. To be admitted to the bar, you needed membership in the private Inns of Court, which charged prohibitive fees. Once you were provisionally accepted, a man had to spend years unpaid or poorly paid as a devil, essentially a clerk, while paying hundreds of guineas in fees and rent just to get established.
It's designed to keep people out.
It was self-perpetuating, designed to exclude anyone without inherited wealth. And the resulting data is stark. Sons of wage earners formed less than 2% of the admissions to Lincoln's Inn, one of the primary inns, between 1923 and 1927. The rigid class structure ensured that access to positions of power remained highly restricted, regardless of who happened to be sitting in the Commons.
This inherent instability, financially rigid control, coupled with all this social and ideological fracturing, it translated directly into catastrophic diplomatic failures after 1919. The League of Nations was supposed to be the great guarantor of peace, but you're saying it was structurally weak right from birth.
It was a failure of compromise and idealism over reality. The French, who, lived next door to Germany, proposed a league with actual teeth.
What would that have looked like?
They wanted a league with its own army and general staff, capable of police action without requiring the unanimous consent of every single member state. The Anglo-Americans, horrified by what they called power politics, rejected this outright.
So what did they create instead?
What they created instead was a body that demanded no real sacrifice of state sovereignty, had no mechanism for action without consent, and whose sanctions were entirely ineffective. They outlawed war in spirit, but in practice, they only subjected it to procedural delays.
So the mechanism designed to prevent the next World War was fatally flawed because the great powers were just reluctant to commit to the use of collective force or sacrifice any national authority.
Correct. And that reluctance combined with the economic panic of 1929 to 1934 to produce the tragedy of economic nationalism. People often assume that the rise of high tariffs and protectionism was driven by malice, but Quigley suggests a more structural, organizational reason for this global self-destruction.
And what was that real devastating driver?
It was the organizational vacuum. The nation-state was the only social unit capable of taking decisive action in the face of the emergency. The international system that was created in the 1920s was just too weak to act.
He has an analogy for this, doesn't he?
He does. He compares it to a fire panic in a theater. People trample each other not because they wish to injure their neighbors, but because in the panic, the individual is the only unit available that is capable of action. The injury to your neighbors, in this case, global trade disruption, is an inevitable accidental result of individual national self-preservation when no functioning larger organizational unit exists to enforce cooperation.
That's a powerful indictment of the weak institutions of the era. Interestingly, though, there were some diplomatic successes during this period, particularly around naval power. Why did the Washington Conference in 1922 work when the League was failing?
Because the naval bargaining was a very limited, very specific set of strategic concessions, not some universal idealistic commitment. The major powers' interests just happened to align perfectly. Britain wanted to end the costly Anglo-Japanese alliance and avoid a naval arms race with the U.S.
Yep.
The U.S. wanted Japan out of East Asia and to restore the open door for trade in China, and Japan wanted to reduce the naval threat posed by the U.S. and ensure the U.S. would not fortify key Pacific bases like Wake and Guam.
So they were able to trade limited concessions that mutually benefited their strategic military goals. Low stakes, transactional success.
Exactly. The success relied on the limited scope and the fact that at that time, naval fleet range was strictly limited by existing fortified bases, which made these regional arrangements effective. You have to contrast that with the League, which required a universal surrender of sovereignty and a deep ideological commitment that just wasn't there.
But the broader European political theater spiraled downward into the disastrous policy of appeasement. You attribute this failure significantly to a specific powerful group within the British establishment, the Milner group.
Yes. This group, sometimes called the Kindergarten, they were central to converting the British Empire into the Commonwealth and wielded immense influence through their connections in the civil service and the press. They were part of the British right and held an unwavering conviction.
Which was?
That Hitler's Germany was the frontline bulwark against the spread of communism. Their ultimate foreign policy aim was a four-power pact, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, that would explicitly and permanently exclude Soviet-Russian influence from Europe.
So their anti-communist ideology essentially blinded them to the reality of German territorial aggression and ambitions.
It was more than blindness. It led to active sabotage of French policy. After 1935, Britain forced France to adopt appeasement. They compelled the French to give away every single strategic advantage they held. They allowed German rearmament in 1935, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, and they systematically lost their allies in the East, which culminated in the sacrifice of Czechoslovakia in 1938.
And what was the fanatical philosophical conviction that drove this group to actually trust Hitler? It seems insane in hindsight.
It was an idealism based partly on their misinterpretation of the New Testament and the writings of Edmund Burke. They held this conviction that if people, even your enemies, were trusted just a bit beyond what they deserve, they would rise to the need and act responsibly.
A noble idea, but...
It was a strategy that was actually successful with the Boers in South Africa and in moving India towards self-rule, but it was applied disastrously to Hitler in the 1933-1939 period, and it led directly to disaster.
This leads directly to the managed crisis of Munich in September 1938. The mounting horror that was felt globally wasn't accidental. You're saying it was orchestrated.
It was a deliberately managed crisis. It was designed to break the Czech will, to resist and to manipulate public opinion in Britain and France into accepting what was a deep dishonor. Propaganda was key. The horror of German mobilization was built up massively while, at the same time, Britain and France were ordering the Czechs not to mobilize.
And they spread rumors to support them.
Oh, yes. Rumors were assiduously spread through influential press channels, often controlled by the Milner network, that Russia was militarily worthless, that Germany could wipe out Prague, Paris, and London in a day with gas and air attacks, and that Czechoslovakia was simply an artificial monstrosity created in 1919.
But Quigley's analysis of the true strategic balance at that moment tells a completely different story. It wasn't true.
The evidence shows the exact opposite of the perceived German overwhelming strength. In September 1938, Germany was militarily inferior. Germany had only 31 to 36 divisions, many of which were at only two-thirds strength facing Czechoslovakia's 34 well-armed divisions.
And what about France and Russia?
Crucially, France had over 20 divisions manning the formidable Maginot Line, and Russia was reported to have 5,000 planes and 100 divisions ready for deployment. German victory was far from inevitable. The isolation of Germany was entirely possible, provided Poland and Romania had allowed Russian air support to pass through. The horror of German strength was manufactured and exaggerated to facilitate the diplomatic sacrifice.
The failure to resist led straight into World War II, which fundamentally changed the nature of conflict into total war.
This was the culmination of the age of conflict. The 20th century saw a shift from the limited warfare of the 18th century, mercenary armies, limited objectives, allowing for a negotiated peace to total war. With the rise of mass armies and nationalism, popular support could no longer be won for limited aims.
You had to give them a grand cause.
You had to mobilize them by appealing to great moral goals or universal philosophic values, such as defending civilization or eliminating evil. This required unconditional surrender and made a negotiated peace almost impossible because once governments were enmeshed in their own moralizing propaganda, they could not publicly admit they were ready to accept lesser aims.
And the distinction between the military and the civilian population completely collapsed.
It did. The sheer brutality reflects the total nature of the conflict. In World War II, civilian deaths, totaling 17 million, actually exceeded combatant deaths. The tragedy is underlined by Polish statistics. Less than 100,000 Polish soldiers were killed in the Battle of Poland in 1939, yet 3.9 million Polish civilians were executed or murdered in the ensuing occupation. The home front was the front.
And despite the terror they projected, even Germany was fighting the war under a severe illusion of their own industrial strength for a prolonged conflict.
Yes, they operated under this dangerous impression, this Sitzkrieg illusion, that they were armed to the teeth. This was factually untrue. Germany lacked real economic mobilization for a long war until 1943. While Allied capacity soared, Germany's industrial output dedicated to armaments was increased only slightly between 1937 and 1942. It demonstrates a profound internal miscalculation regarding the demands of a total extended conflict. They were geared for a quick, brutal campaign, not a marathon struggle against global production.
The pressure of total war, especially the industrial component, forced these dramatic, lasting changes in how organizations and science operated. This brings us to a huge, lasting legacy of the war, the rise of rationalization in operational research, or OR.
Rationalization is the systematic process of applying science objectively and quantitatively to the problem of war and later to all sorts of complex managerial problems. It started in Britain, famously with Professor P.M.S. Blackett, and was massively expanded by the Americans.
And the key insight was that this wasn't just about inventing new, better weapons.
Right. It was about optimizing the use of the equipment and the men you already have.
So operational research was the organizational manifestation of this. What did that scientific approach look like in practice? How did they organize these teams?
Our groups were intentionally mixed teams. You have physiologists, physicists, mathematicians, and experienced military officers, all focused on objective, analytical, quantitative methods. Blackett, who led the effort, argued that scientists coming from outside the traditional military hierarchy could encourage numerical thinking on operational matters, and so can help to avoid running the war on gusts of emotion.
Get the data, take the emotion out of it.
Exactly. They focused on measurable efficiency.
The source gives the classic example of the depth bomb fiasco, where OR proved that military intuition was fatally wrong.
It's the perfect illustration. The RAF Coastal Command was setting their submarine bomb fuses at 100 feet. This was based on flawed subjective estimates regarding sighting time and how fast a U-boat could submerge.
And the OR team looked at the numbers.
They looked at the numbers. Their analysis revealed that the optimal depth to intercept the submerging U-boat should be 25 feet. And changing that single variable, the fuse setting, from 100 feet to 25 feet, increased the success rate by 400%. It jumped from 4% to 17%.
400%, just from a data-driven adjustment.
That simple analytical change saved huge resources and countless lives. It demonstrated the incredible power of objective, specialized data over traditional military intuition.
Did they have other successes that fundamentally changed wartime strategy?
Absolutely. They applied the same quantitative analysis to shipping convoys. Military tradition favored small, fast convoys because they were easier to escort and manage. Seemed logical. But the OR analysts found that the number of ships lost to U-boats was proportional to the number of convoys, not the size of the convoy. So by implementing massive convoys, sometimes 100 ships or more, they drastically lowered the number of escort ships needed per convoy, and the overall loss rate plummeted. This analytical mindset transitioned directly into post-war corporate America, giving rise to systems analysis and modern management consulting.
This shift toward analytical efficiency fueled American wartime production, which, despite the delay you mentioned earlier, achieved an astonishing scale.
The initial response was slow. It's true. Until June 1942, American war mobilization was often stalled because civilian contracts were frequently preferred over defense contracts. It reflected a continued pre-war mindset. But once the country mobilized, the speed was just incredible, primarily due to adopting radical mass production techniques.
Specifically regarding shipbuilding, which was absolutely critical to winning the Battle of the Atlantic.
In all of 1939, the U.S. built only 28 ships. But by adopting these revolutionary techniques like prefabrication and welding sections together, rather than traditional riveting, which was epitomized by the Liberty ships, the scale just exploded. By September 1943, the U.S. was launching 155 ships, aggregating 1.7 million tons per month.
Per month.
Per month. To put that into perspective for you, that is a production rate of 5 ships a day indefinitely, a miracle of specialized industrial organization.
This speed and application of science culminated in what Quigley calls the greatest achievement of science in all human history, the creation of the nuclear age.
It is an achievement that is unparalleled in human history. It's comparable only in its ultimate effect to the invention of farming 9,000 years ago. But unlike farming, which was gradual and empirical, the atomic bomb was swift and purely theoretical. It required scientists to anticipate, measure, and control events, the creation of self-sustaining chains of fission that had never been observed on Earth before.
Why did the Western powers succeed in achieving this while fascist Germany failed?
2 key factors really explain the failure of the Axis powers. First, many of the world's greatest theoretical and experimental nuclear scientists were refugees who had fled fascism. They brought their knowledge and intellectual power directly to the Allied cause.
And the second?
Second, President Franklin Roosevelt was uniquely willing to listen to and act upon unconventional suggestions from the scientific community. Germany, conversely, did not pursue the bomb seriously. They chose instead to focus resources on projects like the V-2 rocket.
The V-2, which devastated London, was a conventional weapon, right?
Yes, and that fact actually provided a massive psychological relief to the Allies. When the first V-2 hit London in September 1944, the Allies had lived in dread that the Germans were holding back until they could perfect an atomic warhead for it. The fact that the V-2 only carried conventional explosives confirmed that Germany's scientific focus had been misdirected and that the Allies had won the scientific race.
The existence of the atom bomb then profoundly and immediately altered international relations post-1945. It essentially destroyed the old diplomatic order.
It fundamentally destroyed the concept of the equality of states. It created 2 levels of global power: the ordinary states and the superpowers.
But paradoxically,
the nuclear stalemate, the fact that any conflict could immediately escalate to mutual annihilation, also created an umbrella of fear. This umbrella allowed much weaker, ordinary states to exist without being decisively acted upon by the superpowers, because no conflict, even a minor one, could be contained below the nuclear threshold without unacceptable risk.
And this led to the modern strategy of constantly escalating deterrence, managed by those same managerial technicians and specialists we keep talking about.
Precisely. The strategy evolved from simple massive retaliation into graduated deterrence, a highly complex system requiring immense commitment and specialized knowledge. This strategy calls for at least 4 predefined levels of possible response to aggression: conventional, tactical, nuclear, strategic, no cities, where you aim only at military bases, and finally, total devastation.
And managing that is a full-time job for an army of experts.
It requires a perpetual army of specialists, strategists, physicists, systems analysts to manage the incredible risk of escalation from one level to the next. #outro.
We've covered ground that spans centuries in its implications, from the entrenched power of the financial oligarchy in the early 1900s to the devastating failure of diplomacy driven by ideological blind spots, all culminating in the rise of rationalized, total warfare managed by these specialized teams. It's a history that's really defined by the transition of control.
The core insight driving all these shifts is exactly that transition. The levers of power moved from industrial owners to highly trained managerial technicians. This permeation of specialized scientific know-how, this rationalization into almost every aspect of life, from managing logistics to building nuclear weapons, it created an army of specialists, as Charles de Gaulle had even foretold back in 1934.
And we've established that the forces that shaped the 20th century were so often operating beneath the surface of traditional democratic structures. The invisible control of the central banks, the hidden governance of the British establishment, the secret complexity of nuclear strategy. What then is the long-term provocative challenge this legacy presents to you, the modern learner listening to this?
The historian Quigley points out that the growth of this army of specialists, the managerial, the scientific elite, undermines one of the 3 basic foundations of political democracy.
Yeah, that is.
The assumption that men have relatively equal access to the information needed to make government decisions.
So if knowledge is power, and that knowledge is now hyper-specialized, complex, and only available to the very few who possess that training,
the final thought we are left with is this: is the specialized, highly rationalized world we now inhabit, where complex systems like high finance, nuclear strategy, and war logistics are controlled exclusively by managerial technicians and scientific experts, Is it inherently incompatible with true democratic choice? If critical knowledge is confined to the specialized few, how can the majority possibly provide informed consent for the decisions that shape the modern world?
That's the question.
That fundamental challenge, born from the age of conflict we've explored, remains the crucial test of whether Western civilization can transition into a true, vital age of expansion, or whether it will stagnate toward universal empire.
A heavy thought to leave you with, but an essential one for understanding the forces at play in our own time. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the history of our time.